Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Standard existing protocols. That is a very interesting question. When you look at the extractive sector, due to the huge demand for capital that's required and the required for technical expertise, most projects are undertaken, or large-scale projects that I say are undertaken by multinational companies. This is predominantly because of the capital that's required and the need to diversify risks. So a number of countries prefer not to, undertake these investments alone, which obviously exposes a lot of our countries to, dealing with multinational companies and negotiating very, very complex agreements with companies that, have been in existence for several decades, work in various jurisdictions, and have a lot of the, technical capability to understand the extent of our reserves more than we do. So that, poses a significant challenge to a number of our countries, because in essence, we're negotiating, not on the vast majority of times, should I say, it's not always, we're negotiating on an unequal playing field. So it is, important for our countries to work together collectively to have some sort of harmonization in terms of our laws and policies and some of the, fiscal instruments that, are incorporated into some of these agreements. What tends to happen is because there isn't that much of uniformity, we end up having what, is generally referred to as a race to the bottom, where we have multinational companies that come to us and they basically negotiate with us against our neighboring countries. So in essence, they come to us and they tell us, oh, we're interested, in exploiting whether it's, oil and gas deposits, and, from our fiscal models, you need to lower your tax, requirements, whether it's, income tax or royalty rates in these agreements. So because a lot of the times we don't have as much information as they have about our geology, they use that against us to negotiate better contracts and use the fact that, we don't have a level of harmonization in our policies to tell you, okay, well, your income tax rate is X amount. Next door, theirs is, a Y, which is, a less than what you have. So we'll just go next door and, basically exploit their resources. So in an attempt to ensure that, we are able to attract these companies, we end up lowering, our tax regimes, just to ensure that we're able to have, this capital. There's an interesting dynamics that's currently going on, obviously, because of climate change. What climate change, in essence, not trying to, play down the adverse impacts of climate change. Obviously, it's real, but it's predominantly affecting the oil and gas sector. A number of our countries have oil and gas, and because of the huge exploration capital that's required, a lot of the companies in our countries cannot actually do these works themselves, so we require multinational companies. And because of, the Paris Agreement and some of the legislations that are being, placed in some of these countries where, they're actually incorporated, what the result of that is that you're having less companies come into Africa to basically exploit for oil and gas. So as a result, it's having that same impact of trying to lower taxes, what African governments would really need to consider is looking at things from a holistic perspective. There's over 600 million Africans without access to electricity. There's over 900, over 900 million Africans basically utilize coal and wood to cook every day. And there's obviously a direct correlation to access to energy, to development and sustainable growth in Africa. So there has to be a level of harmonization. The African Continental Free Trade Area, which was an agreement signed in 2019, aims to try to limit trade barriers and non-trade barriers, which would in essence allow more inter-African trade. And Africa needs to find its own resources, its own capital, and how it's going to exploit its own oil and gas deposits. There's a potential of sovereign wealth funds being used. Africa's sovereign wealth funds, there's over 300 billion of capital, but most of this capital is being invested outside of Africa. So there's a number of challenges when you talk about the mining sector. Am I over my time? Okay. When you talk about the mining sector, it's a bit different, obviously, because of the push to transition. There's now a higher demand for Africa's minerals. So African governments need to take this into consideration and work together, to increase inter-African trade. One of the panelists, mentioned earlier, Dr. Maritz mentioned earlier the agreement between Congo and Zambia. Congo being has the largest deposits of cobalt, which is one of the critical minerals. I think it has 70% of the world's known reserves of cobalt, and Zambia is the 6th largest producer of copper, which are critical minerals are required for this energy transition. Both of these countries have decided to formulate an agreement to be able to create a manufacturing plant for lithium batteries. I mean, these are the sort of initiatives that are required because, as one of the speakers that earlier mentioned as well, the market or the value of our unprocessed minerals, critical minerals, is double-digit billions. Well, when you start processing them, the figure jumps to double-digit trillions. So these are the sort of things that African countries need to be considering. Thank you so much. I don't want to go too much.
Merci tout à fait. Non, c'était parfait. Et c'est vrai que l'Afrique vraiment doit mettre son pied. On l'a dit un petit peu plus tôt. Faut qu'on croie en nous finalement, croire que c'est possible. Changer les mentalités quelque part. Je pense qu'avec un petit peu plus d'audace, peut-être, on pourrait atteindre certains objectifs. Alors, Monsieur Stevens, vous avez mentionné cette nécessité d'harmonisation. Je vais me tourner vers vous, Madame Moussanda, parce que le Forum parlementaire de la SADC, notamment, a adopté il y a un petit peu plus d'un an, la loi cadre relative à la gestion des finances publiques. C'est une grande avancée qui fait finalement écho à ce dont nous parlons ici depuis ce matin. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire pourquoi il était important pour votre région d'adopter cette loi cadre et quel impact cela pourrait avoir sur le reste du continent? Quel message fort, selon vous, ça renvoie aux autres pays?
Thank you, Madam Moderator. And from a parliamentary perspective, I come from the SADC Parliamentary Forum. Yes, indeed, the forum did adopt a model law on public financial management in 2021, July. And this was against the background of a realization that the role of parliamentarians in public financial management was probably not strong enough in the region. And I think it's a kind of a global problem, or at least an African problem, that parliamentarians need to take a stronger role in the manner in which public finances are managed. One of the things that the model law on public financial management actually does focus on is the issue of debt. So there's a whole part in the model law, that is part 8, which actually is focused on the issue of debt and how parliamentarians, part of that is parliamentary control and other safeguards that are intended to be there. I wanted to relate this discussion particularly to the 4 Rs that have been identified, and from the parliamentary perspective, I want to say debt actually directly interests parliaments because it has to do with democracy. Some of the debts are so long-term that you find that successive governments, successive generations, actually find themselves sitting with debt which they know nothing about sometimes. So it's important for proper representation at the time of contracting these debts, proper legislation and safeguards in terms of how we contract these debts is also quite important. So in terms of the 3 Rs, parliaments need to, in my view, reimagine that as institutions of democracy, they should see the reality of the continent's demographics also being reflected in the new financial architecture, the global financial architecture, and the individual countries' economic landscapes. So for example, we need to see how women and young people be assisted, to step up to the plate or to take their rightful role in the economic landscape. Parliaments also need to rethink what are the innovative ways in which they can support small businesses to ensure industrialization. I think it's not in question that Africa has all the resources that we need for our own development and even to interact and support other regions of the world. But there's something we're not doing right. And I think our parliaments as Africa need to step up and come up. And I think there are some honorable members present here. And this is one of the things that the SADC Parliamentary Forum was trying to do in adopting the public financial management model law. It's a gold standard, and it's hoped that the member states will then begin to draw from the provisions there because it's based on best practices, global best practice, and against the background of research. So once they begin to pick from there to put in their domestic laws, because remember, the forum doesn't have the authority or the power, the jurisdiction to make law for the region. But we can use persuasion, and at the moment we're in the process of developing a scorecard. We want to map the region to see where are the different countries in terms of their legislative landscapes, how well are they matching against the model law. Then eventually, hopefully with advocacy, we use the model law as an advocacy tool to help them to bring their legislation up to that standard. In terms of reorganizing, we think that parliamentarians must be at the forefront of repositioning their countries and the continent at large to take charge of our destiny. And parliamentarians have a big role if you're talking about integration, harmonization, policy, legislation. All that requires parliamentary intervention at national level and probably at continental level if we do get to a situation where the continental parliamentary body is going to be in a position to make law. So we think that parliamentarians are a critical stakeholder and they need to be taken along, not to be left behind in the process. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Alors vous avez notamment mentionné, Madame Musonda, l'importance de soutenir les femmes et je pense que c'est une transition toute faite pour vous, Madame Simeoni, parce que vous adoptez une approche assez singulière, panafricaniste et féministe. Alors pourquoi c'est important de prendre cette approche et pourquoi il serait peut-être temps que le continent prenne un petit peu de recul pour mieux bondir différemment pour atteindre ses objectifs.
Thank you. Oh, that's loud. So I'm going to ground you in who I am and the work that we do. My name is Crystal Simeoni. I live and work out of Nairobi, Kenya, and I lead the work of the Nawi AfroFem Collective, and we straddle many struggles. We're feminist against patriarchal systems of oppression. We are Pan-African against neo-colonial and white supremacist systems of oppression, and we're intersectional across these in our approach. And so in preparing for this, I chose to share some of the questions that have been swirling in our minds and in my mind to weave a tapestry of thought. The first is the role of the state, and it's something that's been churning in my head. the idea of social contracts and contracts between citizens and states. And we believe in a centering of the state as we develop, especially in the work that I do, that is continental and global facing, and many people here do the same. Pushing back against a narrative that the African state is incapable of providing for her own. But the tensions exist when we know that many of our states continue to be the very violence on their populations. This violence has very deep roots in our colonial past, and so it's important to remember that what we're pushing for is a centrality of not just the state, but a decolonized African state. We know there are new battlefronts in what Daniela Gabor calls the Wall Street consensus, which ostensibly is manifested by a financialization of life, from healthcare to education to water to housing. Basically, what was a social contract between state and citizen is now a contract between state and private finance. This private finance that is often global north with the face of a white man and big money. Dawn, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, has a new publication out on public-private partnerships with case studies that paint a tapestry of the very same extraction along the very same patterns in different countries across not just Africa, but across the majority world. And through it, we see a very clear formation of a financialization narrative. We continue to see powerful private interest groups and their partners gain excessive influence over policymaking, in part through their respective foreign policies, and eroding both human rights and democratic processes. And this corporate capture of the state has systemic and long-standing influence and is backed by narratives that argue that, one, the state are, through processes of rent-seeking, inherently economically inefficient, and that, two, policy issues are of such technical complexity that ordinary citizens cannot understand and therefore should not or need not engage with them. And this isn't true, and from here I'll quote South B's finest, a book by Makena Maganjo, in which she quotes, "Mrs. Karanja had her monthly budget down pat. She could tell you before the Central Bank of Kenya when inflation was threatening based on her monthly spend. So we know, and we can feel it, and we live it." The disingenuous inference often drawn from this is that private corporations operate in the public interest. What is good for corporations is claimed to be good, self-evidently, for the state and her citizens. The financialization of everyday life means that people have to borrow in order to consume, and the public provision of health, of education, of water, of housing has been replaced by private provisioning of these public goods. The cost of borrowing to meet these obligations has deepened the link between social reproduction and household debt, drawing households into financial systems and trapping them in generational cycles of poverty. And this links so closely to understanding social reproduction. The historical burden of women's labor and burden who carry the daily and generational labor of taking care of homes, of the sick, of children, the very labor that produces and sustains life, against a backdrop of households subsidizing economies and essentially reproducing capitalism. Understanding that this gendered oppression and burden on women continues to reproduce a patriarchal and capitalist system and economy. And so debt, as you can see, is a thread in the weaving of the story of this continent. And not a day goes by without us hearing a story of debt. This year, Ghana signed a new program with the IMF. It's a 17th program they've signed. The 16 programs before was sold as a silver bullet that would unleash Ghana's economic might. Zambia has similarly had 14 programs, and as Ha-Jun Chang spoke this year, he likens it to going to a doctor 17 times for the same problem, and the doctor giving you the wrong treatment all those 17 times, and you keep going back. My own country, Kenya, is also knocking on the IMF doors, and this year, Kenya, for the very first time in my memory, chose to serve their external debt payments before they paid civil servants. We know this story well. It is one of austerity. It is one of drastic cuts in public spending to consolidate the fiscus, and this is what we're told. We know that the services that are most needed by women are the first to go. In its place are private solutions for very public problems, locking services behind user fees that very many women are unable to afford. And not only unable to afford, but the externalization of these women continues to happen. The stripping away of public services doesn't mean that these functions disappear. It only means that women continue to subsidize the state, taking care of the elderly, of children, of the sick, and of homes. Busi Sibeko pushes the idea that a feminist reading of Africa's indebtedness requires that we take into account how debt has led to policy externalization, characterized by neoliberal policies which have undermined the role of states in provisioning the basic goods and services needed to reproduce our societies. The current debt architecture is rooted in a global economic extractive order that is racist, that is sexist, and colonial in nature. It is not designed to build, but instead designed to extract, to continue to feed a system that has always needed subsidy. And that subsidy has always come from the global south. It has come from Africa, from our resources, from our labor. And African women's bodies continue to carry a lot of this burden. We see this clearly through the clear thread that is carried from our country's external debt right through to household debt, and a lot of the time carried by women. African feminists continue to ask who should be in these conversations on debt and what vocabulary is used. Is it resistance to bring to light this link and breathe light to the violence the system places on Africa, her citizens, and especially women? Underpinning a lot of this is a call for reparations, and I think we cannot have a conversation on debt without one on reparations. There's a growing body of work and growing movement that is calling for reparations, not just in repayment of monetary value for all harm caused, but an overhauling of a system that will continue to violently extract even if we were to be paid back. And this sits with 5 components. The first is restitution and repatriation. The second is satisfaction. Third is compensation. Fourth is rehabilitation. And finally, cessation and guarantee of non-repetition. The movement puts forth the idea that those who caused and continue to cause the harm are not those who determine the remedy, and that's important to remember. What this looks like in practicality is what part of what we do every day. The debt justice movement, the tax justice movement, fighting against financialization, so many people in this room. Part of reparative work lies also in decolonizing work. Decolonization means we go back to understanding and historicizing neoliberalism. We cannot undo colonialism without a clear understanding of coloniality and how it continues to reinvent itself and thrive, partly by shaping and dominating the global economic governance system, and that analysis can only be done by us. Part of this understanding, how it undermines indigenous ways of knowing and elevates a specific type of knowing praxis over our own. And so finally, grappling with all this, where do we go as African feminists? We resist in collective. Nanjala Nyabola talks about working to build a solidarity that crosses time and space, one that is not about making everyone the same, but about allowing for the specific in the general, finding that which is human on the other end and protecting it, and learning to see as forms of resistance. Across Africa, there are different forms of women saving circles. In Kenya, where I'm from, they're called shamas. Surviving in a system that is constantly taking from you, led by women, to have these circles as real-life manifestations of social solidarity economics. We resist by redefining, reclaiming, and reshaping narratives based on our own experiences, our histories, our nuances, and our collective destiny. A collective destiny that encompasses both people and planet. We resist by being able to oscillate between the technical and the colloquial. Lino Some says our work must be centered in a process that starts in real life, in the concrete, and only then can we theorize, and when we do, that theory must always, always land back in real life, in the concrete, and the work is incomplete until we follow that path. Our feminist praxis will center on the ability to reclaim and recreate a future, and this really relies heavily on our ability to dream. Ibrahima spoke about us dreaming of a different world, and in our current context, this takes courage and, quite frankly, audacity. To unshackle ourselves from our current reality and be audacious enough to dream of new models, new systems, new governance. This will also mean letting go of hierarchies of epistemology and decolonizing them. Whose work is important because it presents in a certain way, and what does that mean when they get seats at tables of power and decision-making? And that's a question for all of us here in this room. Resistance, to me, also means refocusing the struggle as well. I will lean to Lino Some again here when she says, we cannot keep fighting simply in order to survive. Our struggles are meaningless and certainly not revolutionary if they don't also offer us serious possibility to thrive as human beings. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Madame Simeoni. Une destinée commune, et c'est vrai que nous sommes ici depuis ce matin, nous parlons d'harmonisation des politiques, d'harmonisation des lois, des codes, etc. Et vous venez de nous rappeler que cette harmonie, elle commence dès le foyer, dès la famille, dès les communautés, avec, en offrant une égalité des chances aux femmes, de la même manière qu'aux hommes. Donc merci beaucoup, c'est très inspirant, c'est formidable. Et j'aimerais mentionner que je suis absolument ravie, et c'est un travail remarquable de l'équipe d'AfCoDD d'avoir sollicité autant de femmes passionnantes, passionnées et inspirantes depuis ce matin. C'est vraiment merveilleux de voir toutes ces femmes venir et partager le mot qu'elles ont à dire. Et tout autant que vous, mesdames, dans l'audience, c'est vraiment merveilleux à admirer en fait. Donc merci également d'être venues. Alors, je me tourne vers vous, Monsieur Dr Olomo. L'Union africaine, on le sait, est la garante finalement de cet agenda 2063 qui est très ambitieux. Et l'année dernière, au Malawi, vous nous aviez dit qu'il fallait, dans un premier temps, mettre de l'ordre dans nos affaires avant de partir finalement à l'assaut du monde. Alors, cet ordre, ce matin, on a parlé notamment de faire le ménage. Par où commencer pour mettre de l'ordre dans nos affaires, et puis, donc notamment bien sûr, pour être un peu plus précise, dans les politiques nationales, internationales, et dans le but d'une meilleure gestion de la dette et bien sûr à terme du développement durable.
Merci, merci beaucoup, Madame la modératrice. Je voudrais, à l'entame de ce propos, comme cela a été dit, remercier d'abord AfCoDD et notre cher ami Jason pour l'invitation qu'il a bien voulu formuler à l'endroit de l'Union africaine et surtout pour la qualité des préparatifs pour cette rencontre. Ce que j'ai dit au Malawi l'année dernière reste valable cette année. Pourquoi est-ce que je l'ai dit? Je l'ai dit parce que lorsque vous regardez un petit peu le contexte économique en Afrique aujourd'hui, vous pouvez voir que nous faisons face à un ensemble de difficultés auxquelles nous ne sommes pas préparés. On a la pandémie de la Covid-19, on a les questions de changement climatique et on a ces questions qui sont liées également aux mutations qu'on voit partout dans le monde, c'est-à-dire le changement géopolitique qu'on voit dans le monde. Et si vous écoutez les informations depuis ce matin, vous allez voir qu'il y a un changement fondamental qui s'est opéré encore une fois de plus sur le continent, et ceci concerne un pays qui m'est proche et très cher, le Gabon. Et donc, de ce point de vue-là, il serait important de régler les problèmes d'abord sur le continent. Parce qu'avec toutes les richesses que nous avons les taux de pauvreté les plus élevés au monde. Nous avons un niveau d'inégalité qui ne cesse de croître. Si on regarde les indicateurs, vous allez voir que l'Afrique est certainement la région la plus inégalitaire du monde, parce que le coefficient de Gini du continent est assez élevé, ce qui traduit le fait que les ressources dont nous sommes dotés ne nous servent pas à notre développement. Et cela, depuis ce matin, a été rappelé et c'est clair. Donc, la première chose sur laquelle on devrait se concentrer, c'est de construire une économie qui soit une économie assez résiliente, une économie qui soit basée sur la production des biens que nous consommons nous-mêmes. Un petit exemple. En termes de biens alimentaires, pour se nourrir, l'Afrique importe environ 110 milliards de dollars de nourriture par an pour manger. Dans le même temps, vous êtes le continent qui a 65% des terres arables du monde. Donc, vous pouvez comprendre qu'un pays comme l'Ukraine, qui nourrit l'Afrique, mais c'est une insulte à nous tous. Et il faut qu'on soit clair. Parce que si on ne peut pas se dire les choses clairement, si on ne peut pas chercher des solutions de manière efficace, on n'arriverait à rien. Nourrissez votre population. Produisez, mangez d'abord. C'est la base de la transformation du continent. Parce que imaginez que vous avez 110 milliards qui partent chaque année vers des pays qui produisent. 110 milliards. À ces 110 milliards, il faut rajouter environ 17 à 18 milliards de dollars pour se soigner. Quel est ce continent qui ne peut pas produire de l'aspirine pour ses citoyens? La pandémie de la Covid-19 nous a rappelé combien fragiles nous étions, parce que même les simples petits désinfectants des mains, on ne savait pas les produire. Donc, il faut qu'on règle nos problèmes d'abord ici, avant d'aller parler aux autres. Et l'un des points fondamentaux, c'est l'industrialisation. Il faut s'industrialiser pour que les pays africains soient en mesure de régler leurs problèmes eux-mêmes. Ce matin, j'ai apprécié une intervention qui a dit quelque chose de fondamental, c'est-à-dire que vous ne pouvez pas dire que la dette est mauvaise, parce que la dette en soi n'est pas une mauvaise chose. La dette vous permet de profiter de l'effet multiplicateur qu'elle peut vous apporter en vous libérant de nouvelles ressources. Mais malheureusement, à quoi nous sert la dette? On achète des véhicules, on achète des téléviseurs, on achète des chaussures, des vêtements, et après, on espère que la dette va s'auto-financer et s'auto-payer elle-même. C'est impossible. Si la dette avait été utilisée pour développer l'agriculture, l'Afrique pourrait devenir le panier ou le grenier du monde dans les 5 années à venir. Je prends un exemple tout simple, l'Éthiopie où j'habite. L'Éthiopie, il y a 2 ans, a commencé à produire le blé. Imaginez que tous les Africains réunis, on n'était pas conscient qu'on pouvait produire le blé. Tous réunis. On ne savait pas. On a découvert il y a 2 ans qu'en fait, on avait un potentiel pour produire du blé. Mais ça participe de cette déconstruction qu'il faut avoir en interne pour qu'on comprenne qu'on a un potentiel et que ce potentiel peut être valorisé. Et donc, de ce point de vue-là, il faut produire, produire et produire. J'ai aimé l'intervention de mon collègue juste à côté qui a parlé de la zone de libre-échange continentale. Regardez l'Afrique. Vous avez un marché d'1,3 milliard de consommateurs aujourd'hui. C'est le même marché que la Chine. Dans 2 décennies, vous aurez un marché de près de 2,7 milliards de personnes. Ce sera le marché combiné de la Chine et de l'Inde. Non mais, qu'est-ce qu'on doit vous dire pour investir? Qu'est-ce qu'on doit vous dire pour comprendre que les opportunités qu'on cherche sont ici en Afrique et non ailleurs? Il n'y a rien ailleurs. Et vous le comprenez simplement, et je parle sous le contrôle de ma collègue Marit qui est juste assise là-devant. Depuis 2 ans, le ballet diplomatique qu'on voit à l'Union africaine ne s'est jamais vu au cours des 50 dernières années. Pourquoi? Parce que les Américains, qui sont déjà venus peut-être 3 fois ou 4 fois cette année à la Commission, ont compris que l'Afrique, c'est l'enjeu de demain. L'Afrique, c'est le continent de l'avenir. Les Russes sont venus un nombre incalculable de fois aussi. Je ne parle pas des Européens, je ne parle pas des Chinois, je ne parle pas de tous les autres pays. On les voit matin, midi et soir. Et on ne peut pas imaginer ce qu'ils font dans le noir, parce que ça, c'est ce qu'on voit. Mais maintenant, il faut comprendre que l'Afrique est une superpuissance mondiale qui doit saisir les opportunités et pouvoir s'asseoir à la table des négociations pour parler d'une voix ferme. Un petit exemple. Ça fait 50 ans, ou plus, qu'on a dit qu'on allait créer les institutions financières panafricaines. Imaginez. Ça fait tout ce temps. So, let's just imagine that we have said that we are, creating the African financial institutions. This is 5 decades now. We are speaking the same language every day. We are going from meetings to say to ourselves that we are unable to create those institutions. Yes, we are even convinced that we cannot create them. But let me tell you that time is ripe today to understand that without implementing the policies that we have on the ground, because we don't have a problem of policies, we don't have any problem of rules, we have a problem of implementation of our policies. If we fail doing this, we will never get to solve our problems. Let me finish. I had a meeting 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago with central bank governors. I accepted to be in the panel because I wanted to be stoned and killed there. And I knew I will be killed. Because, you know, I just told them, guys, tell me, this is 60 or 50 years we are talking about the same things. Okay, now you tell me, we are sitting in this room. Are you sure that we cannot set up the African Central Bank? And you know why we need to set it up. Because for the AfCFTA to work, there is need for a single currency. And you know it. For even the discussions that we are having at a global level, your debt, oh, we are that. No, all those things can be solved here. The African Financial Stability Mechanism, that was alluded this morning, that is a simple mechanism that will allow our countries to be able to have a financial stability mechanism that will deal with our problems before going to face people that are mistreating us, that are disrespecting us because of our weakness. Because nobody will disrespect you if you are strong. Never somebody will disrespect you if you stand strong on a position. So, these are our issues. Implementation. So, let me not be stoned here. Let me stop here now, and maybe we will continue the discussion. Thank you.
Non, pas du tout. Merci. Non, pas du tout. C'est passionnant et c'est vrai que malheureusement, nous sommes contraints par le temps. Mais pour rebondir sur ce que vous venez de dire, Dr Olomo, un lion à terre ne se fait pas respecter. Donc c'est tout à fait ça. Alors justement, en parlant de mise en action de ce que l'on sait qu'il faut faire, je vais me tourner à présent vers Madame Habiba Ben Barka, qui nous rejoint donc virtuellement. Elle est, je le rappelle, la chef de la section Afrique de la CNUSED. C'est la conférence des Nations Unies sur le commerce et le développement. Madame Ben Barka, est-ce que vous êtes là avec nous?
Oui, bonjour, vous m'entendez?
On vous entend très bien, j'espère que nous pourrons vous voir également. Pour ne pas perdre trop de temps, je vais entrer dans le vif du sujet en vous demandant de nous expliquer ce que fait la CNUSED justement pour mettre en place une nouvelle architecture de la dette qu'il nous faut et surtout une architecture qui ne porte pas préjudice au continent.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me switch to English, if you will allow it, please. I'm not sure whether you can hear me, but I have a background noise here. But I'm sincerely apologize for connecting a bit late. As far as UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, does, it's looked at if there's any new kind of roadmap we can have to better facilitate the multilateral action to address the global debt burden, not only for at the level, but also for developing countries, including African countries, and also how African countries can better mobilize liquidity basically to finance sustainable development. So our roadmap focuses on 3 key areas. It's how to tackle that high cost of debt burden, and I'm sure the previous discussants have been talking about the high debt burden that African countries have been facing over the past few years because of the different crises that took place globally, and how to, and also given the high risk of that debt distress, what are the different type of restructuring modalities and mechanisms that can be put in place to kind of restructure the debt. And we are looking at also how to scale up basically affordable long-term financing for development. The cost of sovereign debt it's quite high in Africa. It's like the cost of financing debt, especially sovereign debt, is like 8.5 percentage point higher than financing sovereign debt in a developed country. So, and we know that the highest cost also comes from servicing that debt. And when we were able to measure, for instance, the percentage of debt in terms of export is like 114%. And you know, a lot of African countries rely a lot on export, especially into the extractive industries, the commodities. And we know that given the different global disturbances that have happened, that global, if there's any kind of fluctuation in the price of a commodity, it will affect a specific African country's revenues in terms of export. And of course, that will affect its ability to service that debt. So we are looking at it, what can be different type of mechanisms to borrow externally or even domestically. I'm sure those discussions have been brought up earlier today into the conference, looking at how they can borrow even with local currencies, not only borrow externally. And we are also looking at how we can expand the contingency to finance the financing needs of the African countries and developing countries in general. So we made some recommendation on how to reform and strengthen the G20 common framework. As a lot of you might know, that framework was created to address the debt and solvency issues for developing countries, for the Paris Club and the new creditors. But then we believe that it doesn't provide yet a solid platform to restructure the debt of many of the developing countries. So some of the recommendations that we are making to our member states and also our partners is to see how we can expand the framework to also include the private sector creditors. So far, they only include mostly bilateral creditors, but we have noticed that recently in African countries, the private creditors have increased in terms of the share of sovereign debt. They are now about 44% of the debt that have been incurred by African governments are provided by private creditors, but they are not such structure or framework that is addressing the needs of those private creditors. So they provide credit without taking into account some of the servicing capacities of those countries, or without making sure that some of the debt that African countries or borrow, the financing that they borrow really go into financing sustainable development. So we are also making some recommendation on how to review the IMF World Bank their sustainability analysis to make sure that it incorporates the social aspect, but also looking at how it can better address the SDG, the sustainable development financing requirements of African countries. And we are also looking at how, for instance, we can provide better liquidity for countries in terms of crisis. Those issues have been addressed probably within the forum. But I think one aspect that we are also exploring within the UN in general, not only UNCTAD, but the UN in general, is looking at how we can encourage more sovereign borrowing in local currencies. I listened made reference to setting up a Pan-African credit rating agency, and this is critical because countries, whether looking at sovereign debt or even corporate, how they can use some of those credit ratings to borrow locally with domestic local currency, and not only borrow in hard currency, which has a lot of challenges when it comes to servicing that debt when that specific country or that specific borrower has an issue with its exchange that has been fluctuated against the hard currency on which the debt was borrowed. So those are the different type of reforms and development in terms of debt sustainability that the UN in general and UNCTAD in particular is really working with African countries to really ensure that not only they are able to structure the debt, but also they are able to borrow at a more affordable rate, and especially borrow with local currencies. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup Madame Benbarka. Merci d'avoir fait l'effort d'être avec nous. Voilà, nous pouvons enfin vous voir. Alors, nous allons à présent passer à la séquence questions et réponses. Et avant de passer à vous à la salle, donc j'espère que vous avez préparé quelques petits commentaires. J'aimerais me prêter un petit jeu. Donc il y a 4 R, je les répète: réimaginer ou réinventer, repenser, réorganiser et remobiliser. Et je vais m'adresser à chacun de vous avec un R, pour savoir très brièvement ce que ce mot-là vous inspire, et ce sera le terrain pour notre question et réponse. Alors, je vais commencer avec vous, Monsieur Stevens, avec réimaginer, réinventer. Très rapidement, qu'est-ce que ça vous inspire?
Thank you so much. With reimagining and rethinking, when I put it in terms of the extractive sector, I think Africa is in a position right now to change the narrative of being a net exporter of raw minerals or crude oil products to being a net exporter of refined crude oil or oil and gas products or mineral products. As previously mentioned, the amount of capital available, from moving from just exporting raw to doing beneficiation is, astronomical. And those are the kind of figures that limits the chances of Africa finding itself in the position that it is, where it's, struggling to handle its current debt. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Madame Moussonda, je vous donne repenser. Qu'est-ce que cela vous inspire, très rapidement?
Yes, again, I will speak from the parliamentary perspective, and I'll say that the parliamentarians currently have the onerous responsibility of rethinking how they support their economies, especially in the new financial architecture that we hope is going to be created in this whole process. How will they support their economies to be effective players, and how will they ensure that the space is safeguarded for Africa to really come into her own? So the legislation, what kind of harmonization is required, what kind of policy at continental level, how do the individual countries then fit into that continental level harmonization? Thank you.
Merci, merci beaucoup. Madame Simeoni, réorganiser. Qu'est-ce que cela vous inspire?
That's a tough one.
I know.
I'll pick a little bit on the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So, wondering how to reorganize, on whose grounds liberation is framed, in whose words, in whose context. The AfCFTA is lauded as, we've started. Batteries were traded with Ghana from Kenya. They left Kenya. It took them 3 months to get to Ghana. And the route was via Mombasa, Singapore, Ghana. So how much of an African continental free trade area is that? Recentering a conversation on ourselves, on our needs, on our realities. If there's no direct transport route between Kenya and Ghana, what does that really mean? And whose continental free trade does it really belong to? Who has funded the AfCFTA? There's a women and youth protocol that nobody has access to. There's a meeting happening in Dar es Salaam, I think this month in September. No invitations. We don't know who's taking part in it. For who is this free trade agreement beyond, and I guess this is an almost safe space, big business? Who is it really for? Can we be brave enough to reimagine what economies look like that centers other things outside of economic growth, but maybe centering our people like we did in that post-independence period? Patrick spoke about food. Africa was 93% food sovereign in the 70s. I'm ashamed to say what we are now. So, yeah.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Et enfin, Dr Olomo, vous avez remobilisé.
Merci. Je pense que c'est le mot essentiel ici, parce que quand on parle de remobiliser, c'est remobiliser les troupes pour le développement de l'Afrique. Il faut qu'on se remobilise pour que l'élan qu'on a vu dans les années 60 pour développer le continent, déjà pour sortir de l'ère coloniale et entrer dans les indépendances, pour le développement maintenant, il faut qu'on se remobilise aujourd'hui, qu'on soit plus fort, mais surtout qu'on ait confiance en nous-mêmes. Comme je vous l'ai dit tout à l'heure, lorsque j'ai parlé aux banquiers centraux à Livingstone, ils ont été pas contents du tout au début. Mais à la fin, imaginez, ils ont adopté les statuts d'une institution panafricaine qui dormait depuis plus de 30 ans, qui est le African Monetary Institute, ça s'appelle l'Institut monétaire africain, qui est le précurseur de la Banque centrale africaine. Et nous avons pris l'engagement, comme on s'est déjà mobilisé, de faire de sorte que cette institution soit créée en 2024 pour que la Banque centrale, que nous l'ayons d'ici 2030. Et ça, on peut le faire. On peut se remobiliser et la société civile qui est ici, on invite toujours ces acteurs-là à faire davantage de bruit, à se remobiliser davantage pour que le message que nous devons passer à nos autorités soit un message de fermeté, un message clair pour avancer le développement de l'Afrique. Il est temps de se réveiller parce que personne ne viendra ici pour nous mobiliser ou pour nous remobiliser pour nos développements. C'est à nous de le faire, c'est notre responsabilité historique et je veux que vous le compreniez bien, vous tous qui êtes dans la salle, vous tous autant que vous êtes autant complices de ce qu'on a aujourd'hui. Parce que nous utilisons mal nos ressources. Ce n'est pas nos dirigeants seulement, c'est nous tous ici. Donc, c'est à nous de prendre la décision de bien utiliser nos ressources. Vous avez parlé de quelque chose de fondamental tout à l'heure, l'argent que nous perdons en termes de flux financiers illicites. Imaginez, en 2015, on disait qu'on perdait 50 milliards de dollars par an. Maintenant, en 2023, les estimations disent qu'on perd 90 milliards de dollars par an. Ça veut dire qu'on a été plutôt proactif pour voler davantage notre argent et aller le déposer ailleurs et accuser celui chez qui on dépose l'argent. Est-ce que vous voyez un peu? C'est-à-dire que nous avons volé notre argent, nous l'avons déposé chez quelqu'un d'autre, nous accusons cette personne de nous avoir volé, or, le premier voleur, il est ici. N'est-ce pas? Ou bien je me trompe, vous voulez me lancer des pierres, c'est ça? Non mais la vérité est là. Donc il faut se remobiliser pour faire de sorte que ces 90 milliards de dollars, 8 milliards de dollars, soient utilisés pour les infrastructures, parce qu'on a un déficit d'infrastructures de 100 milliards de dollars par an. Ça veut dire qu'on y est presque. Ça veut dire qu'on a l'argent pour payer nos infrastructures. Mais vous allez voir qu'on fait la queue pour aller demander 1 milliard de dollars, tous combinés à la Banque mondiale ou au FMI. Quelle honte!
Et comme vous le dites si bien, on y est presque, mais on n'y est pas encore. Il reste cette audace de penser par nous-mêmes, on le répète depuis ce matin, d'être des preneurs de décisions et pas seulement juste de suivre les décisions qu'on nous impose. Je pense que c'était très très important de le mentionner. Vous avez mentionné tout à l'heure que l'Éthiopie peut produire du blé. Alors pourquoi est-ce que l'Égypte continue d'importer, je crois que c'est 12 millions de tonnes de blé par an? Premier importateur de blé, je pense que ces aberrations doivent cesser. Merci à vous quatre. Je pense qu'il est temps de prendre vos questions, vos commentaires dans la salle, si vous en avez. N'hésitez pas, monsieur, s'il vous plaît, avec la chemise rouge. Levez-vous, s'il vous plaît. Voilà, c'est bien vous. Un membre de l'équipe technique va vous apporter un micro. Il nous reste environ 10 minutes. Vous avez une belle chemise, on ne peut pas vous ignorer.
Ok, bonjour à tous. Moi, je m'appelle Béan Jarret. Je suis le président d'un think tank de recherche basé au Tchad, qui s'appelle CROZET. Je voudrais d'abord féliciter tous les panélistes pour les brillantes expériences et idées partagées avec nous. Alors, je voudrais faire un petit commentaire par rapport à toutes les interventions. Oui, effectivement, l'Afrique, depuis 60 ans d'indépendance, a toujours des institutions qui sont très faibles. Les institutions sont toujours fragiles. Nos États aussi sont fragiles face à l'idéologie internationale. Nous faisons face à la géostratégie et à la géopolitique mondiale, où c'est les puissances qui dictent les lois par rapport à nos propres ressources intérieures. Mais nos institutions sont toujours fragiles face à ces puissances. Ce commentaire m'amène à me questionner par rapport à ces 3 aires que nous venons de voir. Ces 3 aires s'adressent principalement d'abord à l'Union africaine. À l'Union africaine qui devient aujourd'hui, si nous lisons les réseaux sociaux, les commentaires de la jeunesse a perdu complètement la confiance envers l'Union africaine. Parce que la jeunesse accuse maintenant l'Union africaine d'être maintenant le bras pensant des puissances. Parce que face à cette montée en puissance de la géostratégie et géopolitique, l'Union africaine est toujours à la traîne, nos États sont à la traîne, du moment où les puissances et les États s'organisent en regroupement pour être toujours de plus en plus forts, mais l'Union africaine se laisse dicter par les puissances. Et c'est ce qui fait que nos décisions ne peuvent aller nulle part. Face à cette situation, je voudrais poser une question, principalement au chef de division.
Merci beaucoup. Merci. Voilà. Je vais vous laisser peut-être, monsieur Dr Olomo.
Oui, je vous réponds très vite. Merci déjà pour votre très importante contribution. Mais je vais vous dire, vous êtes marié, n'est-ce pas, monsieur?
Oui,
vous êtes marié?
Je n'ai pas fini.
Vous êtes marié?
Oui, je suis marié.
Bien, restez debout.
Ok.
Dites-moi, mon frère.
Oui, je suis là.
Parlons peu, mais parlons vrai.
Ok.
Vous êtes marié, n'est-ce pas?
Oui, je suis marié.
Imaginons que je vienne chez vous aujourd'hui. Je suis élégant, n'est-ce pas?
Très élégant, oui.
Et que je vienne parler à votre femme et que je lui donne l'argent que vous ne lui donnez pas. Vous ferez quoi? Vous allez vous plaindre partout, vous allez pleurer. Comprenez un peu. Mais ce qui est sûr, c'est que mon message sera passé. Vous comprenez un peu. Donc, en fait, le problème de l'Union africaine, c'est un problème de souveraineté. Et c'est pour ça qu'on a parlé tout à l'heure de remobilisation. Remobilisation. Je vous prends un exemple simple. On est en situation de négociation budgétaire. Ma sœur ici est présente. Nous vous disons, à vous, les États membres, que nous avons un budget, je vais prendre un exemple, de $500 pour l'année. D'accord? Vous décidez, souverainement, de me donner $50. Avec les $50, je ne peux même pas organiser une seule réunion qui permette de faire sens. Je ne peux parler à personne. À côté, il y a l'Union européenne qui veut savoir tout ce que je fais chez moi, qui vient avec les $500 que tu me refuses et me les donne. Et mieux, tu m'encourages à les prendre en me disant, oui, c'est bien, prends les $500, mais qu'est-ce que vous voulez en retour comme résultat? Lorsque la population nous jette les pierres, je comprends bien, je suis l'Union africaine, mais laissez-moi vous dire que notre situation est extrêmement complexe. Et même lorsqu'on vous parle en tant qu'État membre et qu'on vous dit, juste un exemple, hein, je ne parle pas de la situation actuelle, on vous dit, respectons la démocratie, les élections, machin, patati et patata. Vous parliez d'élections. Si vous refusez de donner à manger à vos populations, ce n'est pas l'Union africaine. Si vous refusez de construire les hôpitaux, ce n'est pas l'Union africaine qui construit les hôpitaux. Si vous refusez de donner de meilleurs systèmes éducatifs, ce n'est pas l'Union africaine qui vient vous éduquer. Mais à l'Union africaine, il y a tous les textes, n'est-ce pas ma sœur? Tous les textes sont clairs. Il faut une bonne éducation, il faut des systèmes médicaux de qualité, il faut que la croissance soit au rendez-vous et surtout qu'elle soit distribuée pour qu'on crée une société qui soit une société inclusive et une société durable. L'avez-vous fait? Non. Mais vous pointez le doigt sur l'Union africaine, que je ne défends pas, bien évidemment, mais je justifie seulement ce que vous voyez. Donc vous comprenez que c'est une discussion un peu complexe et il faut que nous soyons responsables et remobilisés assez pour dire que cette situation que nous vivons doit s'arrêter. Et il faut qu'elle s'arrête maintenant. Parce que sinon, vous nous livrez à la merci de ceux qui nous donnent l'argent gratuitement et qui nous dictent leurs lois de manière très stratégique. Est-ce que vous comprenez un peu?
Très bien.
Si je veux que vous alliez dans un sens, je vous donne l'argent et vous êtes dans ce sens-là. Merci.
Très bien, merci beaucoup. Alors, qui va oser poser une autre question? J'aimerais juste prendre un membre du public. Monsieur avec la chemise blanche, il nous reste un petit peu moins de 10 minutes. Veuillez vous lever, s'il vous plaît. Tout au fond. Voilà, donc ce sera la dernière intervention pour ce panel. N'oubliez pas qu'il y a un panel qui va suivre.
Thank you so much, moderator. In the interest of time, I will not greet or thank the presenters. I have only one question, and I will direct it to Stephen. But before I do that, please allow me to air my frustrations in terms of mineral resources. We have a state which has entrusted its natural resources to a one multinational entity for 50 years. You can guess which country is that. Sometimes I don't understand whether they are the negotiators, whether they have the best interest of the public at heart when they do that. We don't have access to the contract that the state enters with the mining companies. They are not embracing what is grown in African soil, the Africa mining vision. And at the moment, we don't have a country mining vision. Now my question. My name is Robert Letsazi from Gaborone, Botswana. Stephen, what's your take on the concept of nationalization of minerals? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a really, really important question. In terms of nationalization of minerals, first of all, when you look at our constitutions in most of our countries, the constitution text would always say that the resources belong to the state, i.e. the people from the particular country. And this is quite prevalent in the vast majority of countries. There's a few exception countries that, individuals can own subsoil resources like the USA, for instance. I think, that is the starting point. Governments are only trustees of these resources, and because of their finite nature, what governments are supposed to be doing is signing agreements that ensures that these resources benefit current generations and future generations. And when you look at the countries that are, to an extent, seen as models for resource management, that is the principle that they all adhere to. So, profits, rents are held by sovereign wealth funds, and those sovereign wealth funds invest those resources, and the dividends are for current generation and future generation. Say, for instance, when you look at Norway, its sovereign wealth fund is several $1 trillion. It has a population of about, I think, 7 or 8 million people. But on that 7 billion that is that's currently held by the country, not even all the profits are utilized on an annual basis. Is a fraction of that is utilized on an annual basis. The remainder of that is held because obviously a lot of these resources are subject to boom and bust cycles, to ensure that when prices do go down, there's funds to ensure that whatever development objectives the government has, it can continue with. So I think, in terms of nationalization, I think the resources do belong to the people of each country. In terms of nationalization by having, a state-owned enterprise, being, whether it's the concessionaire. We do have to take into consideration, because of the capital-intensive nature of extracting some of these resources, and it's not that the capital isn't available in Africa, as I explained earlier. Some of our, the capital available to the sovereign wealth funds in Africa is over 300 billion, so that money can be utilized. But because, of the extensive capital that's required, state-owned enterprises going into partnership with multinationals is not necessarily a bad thing, because, you diversify your risk. And as been highlighted by some of the speakers, debt is not necessarily a bad thing. It's unsustainable debt, that's a bad thing. So once you're able to negotiate contracts, that ensure that, you're able to recoup, profits and rents, I'm not against the idea of our government, our state-owned enterprises working with multinationals. Thank you.
Merci. Thank you very much, Mr. Stephen. Mais voilà, nous arrivons à la fin donc du temps qui nous est imparti. Je vois plusieurs mains de levées, mais ne vous inquiétez pas, vous aurez l'occasion de participer donc au prochain panel. J'aimerais bien entendu vous remercier ici dans l'audience de vous être prêtés au jeu, et avant toute chose également remercier mes panélistes, Madame Claire Moussonda, Madame Simeoni, Monsieur Stevens et Dr Olomo, mon co-modérateur aujourd'hui.